On this Tuesday night, could we be on the verge of another federal election?
The opposition is going to have to decide whether they want to make this minority parliament work.
We are going to study the Liberal corruption virus.
The political tug-of-war that could trigger a trip to the ballot box this fall. A small supply of vital equipment causing big problems.
I want to run out of the building screaming.
Global News investigates the desperation at Canada's COVID-19 labs. Will Halloween be scary or not?
I think it's just frustrating to have so many mixed messages.
The tricky subject among health experts. And an astronomical expedition, the secrets this asteroid could unearth about the universe.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We are watching some political maneuvering going on in Ottawa right now that could, depending on how things unfold, trigger a federal election this fall. A showdown is looming over a push by the Conservatives to put the spotlight back on the Trudeau government's connections to the We charity and what the Conservatives claim is a misuse of tax dollars. The Tories want a special committee formed, which they would control. The Liberals accuse them of playing political games and are calling their bluff by making it a confidence vote.
The opposition parties have a choice. Do they want to make Parliament work and work for Canadians, or do they want to vote non-confidence and trigger election? The choice, Mr. Speaker, is theirs.
Now, no party says they actually want an election, or at least they don't want to be the one that triggers it. David Akin is watching all this. David, help us dissect what's happening.
Well, Donna, this has got to be the most Canadian of parliamentary spats. It's a process-heavy dispute over the establishment of a parliamentary committee, and yet Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is ready to plunge the country into an election unless at least one of the opposition parties drops the idea of creating this committee.
And we hope that opposition parties will decide that they want to make Parliament continue to work for Canadians and not side with the Conservatives who've decided that they no longer have confidence in this government.
Conservatives say the government is overreacting and that while they do not want an election, they do want to fulfill their parliamentary function of holding the government to account over the We charity matter.
We are going to study and fight the coronavirus, but we're also going to study at committee the Liberal corruption virus.
There are some discussions among the parties to find a compromise, but it may come down to the NDP to avoid bringing the government down. Jagmeet Singh says he cannot conceive of an election being fought in a pandemic over the composition of a parliamentary committee.
That is outrageous and it is absurd.
And he criticized Trudeau for putting politics above those he was elected to serve.
There are a lot of Canadians that are feeling a lot of pain right now and are worried about more pain to come.
David, the last federal election, you'll remember, was a year ago. Could we really be on the cusp of another one?
Well, it's possible. It would certainly be the first one ever sparked over the formation of a committee. In any event, we will find out how it all plays out when the issue comes to a vote shortly after 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow afternoon. Donna?
All right, stand by. David Akin in Ottawa, thank you. Confusion still lingers over the future of Nova Scotia's lobster fishery. Tensions have been escalating for months. Both Indigenous and commercial harvesters say federal officials are not doing enough to resolve questions about Indigenous fishing rights. As Ross Lord reports, some say they're getting mixed signals.
The finer points of a so-called moderate livelihood for Indigenous fishers are still elusive, even for the Prime Minister.
It is work that needs to be done properly, respectfully, and in partnership with everyone involved in a nation-to-nation relationship and bringing along the commercial fishery community as well.
But commercial and Indigenous harvesters say they're getting mixed signals from federal authorities. In Cape Breton, fishers licensed by the Boatletech First Nation say the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is undercutting their livelihood by seizing lobster traps.
They were removing any traps that were not tagged with authorized tags from DFO. Now, our tags are issued to us from our band under our own livelihood plan, self-governing ourselves.
Commercial fishers complain there are far more Indigenous traps in the water than the 550 included in Sabaganagati's new fishery. They point to a shipment of lobster caught by Indigenous fishers in 2017 in these same waters. The shipment of almost 3 metric tons was intercepted by DFO, and a Chinese plant owner was convicted of illegally selling the catch. Leaders on both sides say the lack of agreement opens the door to more violence, like the weekend fire that burnt down a lobster pound that did business with Indigenous fishers.
Our people are out there, very limited trap supply, but they're there, and there hasn't been any commercial boats out there in a couple of days now.
Federal Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan says she'll appoint a special representative this week, another attempt to reach a common understanding. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
Now to the pandemic, a couple of things to bring you up to date on. Manitoba is reporting another spike in new cases. There were 110 positive cases in the past 24 hours in Manitoba. Outbreaks have been declared at an elementary school and in 3 personal care homes in Winnipeg. Manitoba still has the highest number of active cases per capita in Canada. In Quebec, 877 new cases were reported today. Tight restrictions are already in place in Quebec City and Montreal, and now the city of Joliette and surrounding areas will move into the red zone as well on Friday. Cases are still on the rise in parts of Ontario, too. More than 800 new infections were reported today. At the same time, testing numbers have dropped. Just over 24,000 tests were processed in the last 24 hours, the fewest in a single day since early September. People had been waiting up to a week for their test results. Today, Premier Doug Ford claimed that backlog has been cleared.
We had a little blip there for a week, 2 weeks. Now it's all caught up, so anyone who's going to get a test, you can get a result almost immediately, a day later, 2 days later.
There is another problem that is putting a strain on COVID-19 testing in Canada. As our chief investigative correspondent Carolyn Jarvis reports, a small but crucial piece of equipment is in short supply.
Pipette tips.
Pipette tips.
Pipette tips.
Here's something no one expected to be talking about 7 months ago. Pipette tips. A tiny piece of plastic that's crucial in a COVID-19 test, and the latest part of the supply chain that's nearly impossible to get.
We thought that supply chain was secure, and lo and behold, our delivery doesn't show up.
I never thought in a million years I would be trying to find pipette tips from, any supplier that I can.
And it's not just pipette tips. Any sort of plastic used in COVID testing, referred to as consumables, is running dangerously short. This document, obtained by Global News, was put out by Ontario Health in the last week and lists 15 different types of plastics used by labs that are in short supply, many of them at high risk. We contacted the companies listed, and only one of them responded, saying because of American demand, getting any product out of the U.S. is impossible, and they're now looking to China.
Like all of that back corner with the yellow tags, those are all pipette tips.
This never-before-seen footage taken inside the shared hospital lab at Toronto's Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre shows a stockpile of these scarce plastics.
If you run out of one piece of your algorithm, the whole lab comes to a halt.
At St. Joseph's Hospital in Hamilton, a former office is now a secret storage closet. So this is gold?
This is gold.
And these boxes will only last 2 weeks.
The fact that we even have to lock up our supplies and gloves and keep them in an area so that other people don't know about it, it's unbelievable.
Some distribution companies have now taken to rationing items.
And that's frustrating to just see the equipment sit there idle.
For the people trying to figure out how to make do without, the pressure is crushing.
I want to run out of the building screaming, and I have to tell you, our laboratory technologists are having moments where they have to stop and cry.
To survive, labs that have are sharing with those that don't. And if a lab still can't process tests, samples are being shipped elsewhere.
This is not a normal procedure. This is full-time crisis, wartime mode.
The question many are now asking is why hasn't Canada secured a domestic supply chain for its labs, like it did with PPE? The federal government says it has signed contracts with companies to secure some supplies in Canada, but the bottom line is labs are still struggling. Donna?
Carolyn Jarvis in Toronto, thanks. October 31st is fast approaching, and Canadians are coming up with creative ways to celebrate Halloween. Dozens of paddleboarders dressed up for a Halloween costume party in Toronto's harbour. In Mississauga, these witches swapped their brooms for boards. Trick-or-treating, though, is going to be different this year. In some places, it's been cancelled. In others, seriously modified. Now is not the time for lots of close contact. As Heather Yourex-West explains, Halloween is yet another tradition complicated by COVID-19.
When you're a kid, it doesn't get much better than this. A chance to dress up, be with your friends, and collect candy. So it's no wonder there's a lot of disappointment in cities like Toronto, where trick-or-treating has effectively been cancelled.
I think it's just frustrating to have so many mixed messages, and Halloween is a big deal and kids are outside.
Mixed messages because outside of Ontario's hot zones, trick-or-treating is still going ahead, even in cities like Edmonton, where COVID-19 cases are on the rise.
I have no plans to suggest that Alberta cancel Halloween this year. My own children would never forgive me. In many ways, Halloween is actually safer to celebrate than other holidays.
If you think about traditional trick-or-treating, if you really do stay outdoors the whole time, if you really do stick with your family, put on masks, avoid crowds, and are mindful about hand hygiene, this is about as low risk as it gets.
But Ontario's premier says in the midst of a second wave that has yet to peak, his province's top doctors disagree.
I have to take the advice of the chief medical officer, which I have, and move forward with it.
Which means no trick-or-treating in Toronto or Ottawa. The Prime Minister says his own family plans to heed local advice.
Listening to public health officials means that my family will not be going trick-or-treating this year.
But what about in communities where public health officials have said trick-or-treating is okay?
It's important to check with your local health authority because Toronto isn't the only hotspot.
Craig Jenny says if you're heading out, review local guidelines and make sure costumes include a mask.
The big key, though, to remember is that a Halloween mask is not the same as a medical mask. And we would ask that if you're going to wear a mask, that you're doing so still with the kind of mask you would wear to the supermarket or to schools.
It's set to be yet another holiday unlike any other, Halloween under COVID-19. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
In the U.S., which has the most cases of COVID-19 and the most deaths, millions of people are not waiting until November 3rd to vote. A record 35 million people have voted early in the presidential election. Though it's not easy for everyone. Voter suppression, discouraging or preventing certain groups of people from casting a ballot is a real issue for millions of Americans. As Jackson Prosco explains, the U.S. is one of the few Western democracies that makes it difficult for citizens to have their say.
They say everything's bigger in Texas. And in sprawling Harris County, home to Houston, this is the incredible line to return a mail-in ballot. There's just one drop box for 4.5 million residents.
It really does not make sense. It's totally inconvenient.
But we had to do it.
Instead of making it easier to vote during the pandemic, the governor of Texas made it harder, ruling each county could only have one box, claiming it's an issue of election security.
Anytime you see governments, I think, trying to take actions that appear to make voting harder, it should raise questions.
Experts see yet another attempt at voter suppression in a country full of examples. State after state has purged millions of eligible voters from the rolls. In many states, the deadline to register to vote has come and gone. Then there are the increasingly strict voter ID laws.
Unlike Canada, which has universal voter registration, which has a national uniform method for federal elections, and which has national voter rolls, none of those exist in the United States.
It's up to each state to decide how the election is administered. In Georgia, where there's a long history of voter suppression, black voters are more likely to face long waits to vote than white voters. In Pennsylvania, there have been running court battles over which votes should count. The Supreme Court ruled that mail-in ballots returned up to 3 days after the election are valid, despite the objections of Republicans.
Where we are heading is that we are headed to a complete degrading of our democracy, where we'll essentially exist as a democracy in name, but not in fact.
It'll end up being a rigged election.
Even President Donald Trump's own words about the election are seen as a way of discouraging voters. Despite so many obstacles, it may all be having the opposite effect, drawing historic early turnout, with Americans more determined than ever to vote. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
A police officer found not guilty in the death of a black man in Ottawa. Coming up, the reasons for the verdict and why the victim's family is devastated. An Ottawa police officer has been found not guilty in the case of a black man who died after a violent arrest. Abdirahman Abdi, who struggled with his mental health, died in 2016. Constable Daniel Monsian pleaded not guilty to manslaughter, aggravated assault, and assault with a weapon. The case centered on the officer's use of force during the arrest. Mike LeCouture reports on the verdict and the reaction, and a warning some of the video in his story may be disturbing.
The family is devastated by the decision.
Abdirahman Abdi's brother, Jama, was at a loss for words moments after the verdict. This was not the result they expected.
We were in telephone contact with other members of the family. They are truly devastated by the decision.
4 years ago, police were called about reports that Abdirahman Abdi had assaulted women near a coffee shop. After unsuccessful attempts to arrest him, Constable Daniel Monsian arrived on the scene as backup, delivering several blows to Abdi's face and head while wearing reinforced gloves. An autopsy revealed the Somali-born man suffered a heart attack over the course of the arrest and died the following day as a result of brain hypoxia, something that factored in Justice Robert Kelly's decision, writing, "I am left in a state of reasonable doubt about whether Constable Monsian's acts caused Mr. Abdi's death." Unlike other times during this 72-day-long trial, Constable Monsian avoided the media Tuesday, allowing his lawyers to speak for him instead.
He feels, as I said earlier, greatly relieved that this ordeal is over and looking forward to going back into the service.
Late Tuesday, a peaceful protest in support of the family had one clear message.
This so-called justice system continues to fail to protect a certain segment of the population, and in particular, Black, Indigenous, and racialized people.
Monsian still faces disciplinary charges under the Police Services Act. This trial has echoed calls for better police training. Evidence revealed Abdi struggled with mental health. While the police union welcomes more training and mental health help, it points out Abdi's mental health was never communicated to responding officers.
This was a call for criminal sexual assault. In this situation, you would never dispatch somebody from the mental health field to this call. That would be completely inappropriate, be unsafe for the person.
The family is pursuing a civil lawsuit against the police officer, and while they know it won't bring back Abdi, they hope it will result in change to the system so that this doesn't happen to another family. Mike LeCouture, Global News, Ottawa.
Bolstering broadband still ahead, the internet plans speeding up in Canada. Much of central Vietnam is underwater as the region braces for a third cyclone this month. 6 times the normal amount of rainfall has already fallen in October, and flooding is extensive. At least 100 people have died. More than 90,000 others have been displaced by the rising water and landslides. SpaceX has moved a step closer to launching its satellite internet service in Canada. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission has approved the company's application for a license to provide a high-speed service called Starlink. Lots of Canadians who live in rural areas support the idea. They long for fast and affordable internet service. Starlink has more than 800 satellites in orbit, though not all are operational. SpaceX founder Elon Musk wants to add thousands more. His goal is to offer high-speed internet to rural areas everywhere. Canadians don't have access to it yet. Starlink still needs to test the service, which could begin in Canada and the northern U.S. later this year. Musk plans to expand to near global coverage by 2021. An astonishing asteroid mission next. What's happening right now, 320 million kilometers from Earth. An intricate operation has just taken place far, far away from us in space. NASA's OSIRIS-REx spacecraft touched the surface of an asteroid, vacuuming up some precious samples. As Mike Drolet reports, getting to this point has taken years of intense and complex work, and finally the engineers have watched it all pay off.
For a few seconds, OSIRIS-REx kissed the asteroid known as Bennu, allowing its vacuum to suck up a few kilos of rocks.
OREX MSA on OREX Ops. Sample collection is complete, and the back-away burn has executed.
And just like that, it was off again. Its mission now to return its valuable cargo home for scientists to study.
You bring back that amount of material to Earth-based laboratories, and it's literally Christmas for the next 10 years for scientists here on Earth.
Scientists say the material on Bennu hasn't changed since the universe was formed. Studying it could unlock secrets to how planets and life began.
And liftoff of OSIRIS-REx.
OSIRIS-REx launched in 2016 with a clear mission: get close enough to an asteroid with a diameter roughly the height of the CN Tower and scoop up some of its sandy surface. Except as OSIRIS-REx got closer, the images it sent back threw the mission a curveball. Instead of sand, Bennu was covered with enough rocks that NASA put OSIRIS in orbit for a year to find a clear enough spot to continue the mission.
They originally expected to be able to put the spacecraft down in a mall that, say, had 100 parking spots. But now, with the danger associated with the boulders, the strewn nature of the surface, they've got to put it down to like within half a dozen parking spots.
Bennu and OSIRIS are on the other side of the universe, 320 million kilometers away. So far that it takes 18.5 minutes to transmit a message back to Earth. So NASA engineers could only program OSIRIS and wait. They'll get their first images tomorrow and then wait some more until 2023 to see OSIRIS's precious cargo in person. Mike Gerlay, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Val des Sources. It means Valley of Springs, and it's the new name residents of the Quebec town of Asbestos have chosen. It was once home to the world's largest asbestos mine. That shut down in 2011, and residents hope the rebrand will shed the town of ties to the toxic material. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.